The convenience store was bustling with activity on a bright afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the shelves stocked with snacks and drinks. At the counter, a quiet older man, Steven Seagal, stood casually, observing the hustle of the store, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the chaotic energy around him. A young thief, his eyes darting around nervously, slipped into the store unnoticed. He was quick, his movements subtle, but his intentions were clear. He spotted the cashier distracted by a phone call and saw an opportunity, the perfect moment to strike. He moved toward the cash register, his hands slightly trembling, as if preparing to make his move. Meanwhile, Steven, seemingly unaware of the approaching threat, continued to peruse the aisles. His eyes never once strayed from the shelves, but his presence was commanding. The thief, however, didn't know that Steven wasn't just an ordinary customer. In fact, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The thief's plan was simple: get to the register, grab the cash, and get out. But as he reached for the counter, he caught Steven's gaze. It was a quick glance, just a momentary connection, but something in Steven's calm stare made the thief hesitate. For a split second, the thief felt a pang of doubt, but the thought quickly passed as he focused on his target. Unbeknownst to him, Steven had already noticed the man's every move. He'd seen it all before: the nervous fidgeting, the quick glances, the attempt to blend in. But Steven didn't react. He didn't have to. His training, his experience, all of it had taught him to remain still, to wait for the right moment to act. The thief, growing bolder with each passing second, took a step closer to the counter, unaware that the moment he crossed the line, everything would change. Just as he reached for the register, something in the air shifted. A sense of calm washed over the store, as if time had slowed down. The thief's fate was sealed, and the events that followed would unfold faster than he could ever have imagined. Have you ever seen someone underestimate someone else like this? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The convenience store continued to hum with the ordinary rhythm of the day. Customers moved about, oblivious to the quiet tension building in the corner of the room. The thief, feeling the rush of adrenaline, pushed forward with determination, inching closer to the cash register. His plan was clear: he would take the money, and by the time anyone realized what happened, he would be long gone. However, the presence of the older man by the snack aisle never left his mind. The calm, almost serene air around Steven Seagal seemed to mock the chaos of the young thief's thoughts. It was as if Steven's stillness itself was a warning that the thief wasn't as alone as he thought. As the thief moved closer to the counter, a young cashier turned back just in time to catch him in the act. She froze for a moment, her eyes widening, but the thief's nervous glance made her hesitate. Before she could react, the thief had already taken a step back. He wasn't about to let anyone ruin his plan now, not when he was so close to success. He brushed past her, ignoring her concerned stare, and continued on his path. But as he reached for the register, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Do you think you can get away with this?" Steven Seagal's voice was calm, almost neutral, but it carried an undeniable weight that stopped the thief in his tracks. The thief whipped around, eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to confront him, let alone the quiet older man who seemed lost in his own world just moments before. But now, Steven stood there, his posture unshaken, his expression one of calm authority. For a brief moment, the thief considered backing off, but his pride wouldn't let him. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about proving something. Maybe he was just looking for an excuse to escape, but something in Steven's eyes made him feel trapped. For a split second, the thief wavered, unsure of what to do. But before he could respond, Steven took another step forward. The thief's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized it before, but something about the older man's presence seemed to loom over him, demanding respect. The thief scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado. "What, you think I'm afraid of you?" His voice was shaky, but he forced a grin. He couldn't show fear, not now. He needed to stay in control. Steven didn't react to the words. He simply folded his arms, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no anger in his eyes, no threat, just a calm understanding that the situation was about to reach its breaking point. As the thief's frustration grew, he tried to get more aggressive. "You don't know who you're messing with. I've got nothing to lose." But Steven remained calm, his voice low. "That's the problem. He didn't explain further, but the words seemed to hang in the air, a challenge to the thief's bravado. The cashier, still frozen behind the counter, looked on in confusion. She didn't know whether to intervene or wait for the inevitable. But something about the scene told her this wasn't a typical confrontation. She'd seen her fair share of aggressive customers, but this was different. This wasn't about a robbery anymore. The thief's posture was shifting, and the energy in the store had changed completely. One of the other customers, noticing the tension, glanced toward the door, ready to leave, but something held him back. He stood frozen, as if waiting for something to happen. The air in the store felt dense with expectation. It was as if time itself had slowed down, the chaos of the world outside forgotten for just a moment. Then, the first real sign of discomfort appeared. The thief glanced nervously over his shoulder, unsure of where to turn next. The moment he took his eyes off Steven, he made a critical mistake, and that would be the turning point. The thief, trying to regain control, started backing away toward the door, but as he moved, Steven was already one step ahead. His calm demeanor had shifted ever so slightly. The store was still silent, every eye on the thief now. The tension was palpable, a slow-moving storm that would break the moment the thief made the wrong move. As the thief's hand reached for the door handle, he was already aware that there was no escape. His confidence had shattered, and the room had become a cage. The consequences of his actions were about to become very clear. The thief's hand hovered over the door handle, his fingers trembling as he grasped it. He was on the verge of escaping, his heart racing with a mix of fear and adrenaline. But as he tried to push the door open, he realized something. The calm presence of Steven Seagal had already done its work. His confidence, once built on the illusion of control, had completely crumbled. Steven remained still, watching intently, his arms folded, his gaze unwavering. There was no anger in his eyes, no tension in his body, just an overwhelming sense of calm that seemed to have locked the entire store in place. The thief, now more confused than ever, turned back toward Steven, his grip tightening on the door handle. He wasn't sure what had happened or how it had all shifted so suddenly, but he knew that he wasn't in control anymore. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a thick fog. "You think I won't stop you?" Steven's voice cut through the silence, calm and confident, yet carrying an undeniable authority. His words were soft, but they carried a heavy warning. The thief, already on edge, snapped, "I'm not scared of you. Don't try to act like you know anything about me." But Steven didn't rise to the challenge. Instead, he simply stepped forward, the faintest shift in his posture signaling that this moment was no longer about words. The thief, still clutching the door handle, froze. For the first time, he truly realized that the situation had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. "People like you always underestimate those who don't make noise," Steven said, his voice still calm but edged with an undeniable finality. The thief's face twisted with frustration. He had expected resistance, but not this level of composure, this absolute certainty. The older man hadn't moved an inch, yet the tension in the air was thick enough to slice through. The thief, who had once felt in control of the situation, was now a mere shadow of his former self. Trying to regain his composure, the thief took a step back and scanned the room quickly. His mind raced, seeking an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The store felt like it had shrunk, the walls closing in around him. His eyes darted between the door, the counter, and the silent onlookers, as though searching for a sign, anything that might allow him to slip away unnoticed. But then, just as he turned back to the door, he noticed something strange. The cashier, still frozen, had her phone out, her fingers hovering above the screen, but her eyes were glued to Steven. It was clear she was more focused on him than the thief. The other customers in the store had all stopped what they were doing, their gazes fixed on the thief, some with mild curiosity, others with a hint of apprehension. No one was reacting the way they should in a situation like this. It was as though everyone in the store was waiting for something to happen, and the thief could feel it, the sense of inevitability. Just then, the door swung open behind him with a loud chime. The store manager stepped in, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the scene. He wasn't alarmed, not like someone who had just witnessed a robbery in progress. Instead, he moved forward with a slow, deliberate pace, his gaze locking onto Steven. There was a pause, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The manager's expression shifted, ever so slightly, from indifference to recognition. The thief glanced over his shoulder, eyes widening with sudden panic. He hadn't expected anyone to enter, let alone someone who seemed to know exactly what was going on. The manager's gaze flicked to him, then back to Steven. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" the manager asked, his voice low, but filled with authority. The thief blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. The manager's eyes were not filled with anger, but something far more unsettling: respect. The thief started to back away again, but before he could make another move, the manager turned his attention fully to him, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You've just made a huge mistake." The words were quiet, but they hung in the air with the weight of something much larger than the thief could comprehend. The silence in the store was deafening. The thief's hands were shaking as he realized the gravity of his situation. He wasn't facing just a random customer. He was facing someone who carried a silent power, someone who commanded respect without saying a word. "Do you know who this is?" the manager asked, his eyes now fixed on the thief. The thief looked between Steven and the manager, confusion written all over his face. He shook his head, unable to process what was happening. "This man," the manager began, his voice steady, "trained the tactical team that protects this entire city." The thief's stomach dropped. He had no idea what he was dealing with. Not just any team. The ones who handle situations just like this. The manager's gaze never wavered. The thief, realizing the magnitude of his error, felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had underestimated the quiet man, and now there was no escape. His fate had been sealed by his own arrogance. Have you ever been caught off guard like this? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The room seemed to freeze in time as the thief stood motionless, his breath shallow and erratic. He had been so certain that this would be a simple, quick theft. In and out. But now, as the store manager's words echoed in his mind, the full realization of his mistake began to hit him. He hadn't just tried to rob any random person. The man in front of him was someone with a reputation, someone far more capable than he could have ever imagined. The feeling of being trapped grew stronger by the second, suffocating him in the cold air of the convenience store. The thief glanced around the room, his eyes darting from the manager to Steven Seagal. The man who had stood so silently by the snacks, observing everything with that unnerving calmness, was now the center of attention. The store manager, having fully recognized who Steven was, stood with an air of quiet authority, the kind that came with knowing someone's history. The thief's pulse quickened, and for the first time, he felt like the entire world was closing in around him. Steven Seagal didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone had already accomplished what most people would need words to do. The thief's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but all the doors were closing. He had been so sure of himself, but now he was trapped in a situation he couldn't talk his way out of. Every instinct told him to flee, but something about Steven's quiet composure made that seem impossible. The manager's voice cut through the silence again, deeper this time, like a man who had seen enough. "You think you can just walk in here and do whatever you want?" The manager's eyes bore into the thief, unrelenting. "This man, the one you thought you could rob, is someone who has trained the best. He's been involved in some of the most critical operations, not just here, but across the world. He doesn't need to do anything to stop you. He's already stopped you with just a glance." The words hit the thief like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, feeling the weight of his mistake crushing him. He had no idea who Steven was, but now it was clear. The man standing in front of him wasn't just some passive bystander. He was someone who commanded respect, someone who had earned that respect with every action he took, both on and off the screen. The thief looked at Steven, searching for any sign of emotion, any clue as to what this man might do next. But there was nothing. Steven's face remained calm, his eyes steady. There was no anger, no fear, just a quiet, overwhelming sense of control. It was like staring into the eye of a storm, knowing that it was only a matter of time before everything would change. The store's other customers, who had been silently watching the exchange, began to murmur among themselves. They hadn't realized the gravity of the situation at first, but now, as they understood more of what was going on, they couldn't look away. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pulled out their phones to record the moment. The tension in the store was palpable, and it felt like the air itself was charged with anticipation. The rookie thief, now realizing the full extent of his error, took a step back, his voice trembling as he tried to salvage some shred of dignity. I didn't know who you were," he muttered, his eyes flicking nervously between Steven and the manager. His bravado was gone now, replaced with a deep sense of fear. "I just thought. I didn't think." "You didn't think," Steven interrupted quietly, his voice cutting through the thief's rambling. "And that's your mistake." The thief's heart sank further. He had no words to defend himself anymore. The reality of the situation was settling in. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The store, once a backdrop for a simple robbery, had now become the scene of a lesson the thief would never forget. The manager looked at Steven, his respect clear. "This man," he said, his voice now softer, more respectful, "was one of the best in his field. Trained in ways you couldn't even imagine. He's not the kind of person you want to cross, especially not in a place like this." The manager glanced around the store, and everyone seemed to understand exactly what he meant. They knew the kind of trouble someone like Steven Seagal could cause, not because he wanted to, but because he had the ability to end things with a single movement, if needed. Steven turned to the thief, his gaze unwavering. "You thought you could take something from me, but what you didn't realize is that I have nothing to prove. I don't need to fight you. I don't need to show off. The only thing you've stolen is your own pride." The thief stood frozen, unable to speak. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The realization that he had tried to rob someone with such a profound skill set hit him harder than anything else. He hadn't just failed in his robbery attempt, he had learned a lesson in humility, one he would never forget. As the tension began to settle, the store manager spoke again, this time to the other customers. "This is a lesson for all of you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Never underestimate anyone, especially the quiet ones. You don't know what they're capable of." The thief's face turned pale, and his eyes darted between the exit and Steven, but he knew it was too late. The door was no longer an escape. It was a reminder that there were consequences to actions, consequences that were far beyond what he had ever imagined. Steven Seagal, the man he had thought was just another easy target, stood there, unchanged, the embodiment of calm power. The thief could no longer deny it. He had made the mistake of his life. With a final glance at Steven, the thief slunk away, defeated. He had learned a hard lesson in that brief encounter, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The store manager nodded at Steven, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson learned, before turning to the rest of the customers. They, too, had witnessed something that would remain etched in their minds, a reminder of how quickly things could change, and how sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one you should fear the most. The air in the convenience store was thick with tension as the thief, now utterly defeated, stood frozen in place. His body trembled slightly, his mind scrambling for a way out, but there was no escape. Not this time. He had crossed a line, and now, it seemed like the entire store was waiting for the inevitable. The store manager had already made it clear that this was no ordinary confrontation. The calm, collected presence of Steven Seagal had made it more than just an attempted robbery. It had become a lesson in humility that would echo in the thief's mind for the rest of his life. The manager, sensing the gravity of the situation, motioned to one of the other employees to call the police. While it wasn't necessary to escalate things further, the store's policy required them to report any theft, and the thief's actions had crossed that line. But even as the phone rang, the atmosphere remained oddly calm. The chaos and panic that would usually accompany a robbery were absent. The store was still. Every person present was aware of the quiet tension, but there was no shouting, no frantic movement. Everything was measured, deliberate, as though the world outside had completely forgotten what was happening in here. Steven Seagal, standing motionless, didn't take his eyes off the thief. His expression was still one of stoic calm. He had dealt with much more dangerous situations than this in his life, both on screen and off. His training, his vast experience, had taught him that the best response to aggression wasn't to fight back immediately, but to remain composed and let the situation unfold. The thief was the one who had taken the first step down a dangerous path, and now it was up to him to deal with the consequences. The thief swallowed hard, still unable to process everything that was happening. He had tried to rob Steven Seagal. And now, in front of everyone, he was realizing just how badly he had miscalculated. He had assumed that because Steven was an older man, he would be an easy target. But he had underestimated the calm strength that came with years of experience and the powerful aura of someone who had lived through countless battles, both physical and mental. The thief had expected a quick, easy confrontation, but instead, he had stumbled into a trap of his own making. Steven's voice broke through the silence. "It doesn't have to end this way," he said, his words quiet but firm. "You don't need to make it worse than it already is. You're already in over your head." The thief glanced up at Steven, his eyes wide. He had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? Steven Seagal was more than just a name. He was a legend. A martial artist, an actor, a former police officer. He had a reputation that preceded him. But hearing the stories was one thing. Being in the same room as the man himself was something entirely different. The thief had thought he could handle it, but now, with the weight of Steven's gaze bearing down on him, he realized how foolish he had been. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean." Steven cut him off with a single measured gesture. "You didn't think. That's the problem. People like you always think they can get away with things because they don't take the time to think about the consequences." The thief stood there, speechless, as the realization hit him like a wave. The humiliation of having been caught was nothing compared to the shame of knowing just how badly he had misjudged the situation. He had expected an easy win, but instead, he had walked straight into the most embarrassing defeat of his life. The store manager, who had been watching the interaction quietly, stepped forward again. His tone was serious, but not unkind. "You've made a mistake, and you're going to have to deal with it. But the best thing you can do right now is take responsibility for what you've done." The thief, now with nowhere to hide, nodded slowly. He knew the police were on their way, and there was no way out of this. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the store on him, and the shame was overwhelming. The people who had been casual observers of the robbery were now witnesses to his downfall. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the fear he had felt when he first entered the store was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt now. He glanced back at Steven, who was still standing there, calm and composed. The older man didn't say anything else, but there was an undeniable air of finality in the way he carried himself. He had shown the thief what true strength was, not in words, not in physical action, but in the ability to remain unmoved in the face of aggression. And that lesson, more than anything else, was what would stay with the thief long after the police arrived. The manager spoke again, his voice firm but with a touch of empathy. "Look, I'm not here to make your life harder. But you need to understand that actions have consequences. And when you try to take something from someone who has earned everything they have, you end up losing everything you thought you had." He looked over at Steven with respect before turning back to the thief. "You've learned that the hard way." The thief stood silently, his head lowered in shame. He had learned a hard lesson in a matter of minutes. It wasn't just about the robbery anymore. It was about respect, about understanding the strength in silence, and realizing that not every battle was won with violence. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon was the ability to remain calm and composed in the face of chaos. As the police arrived and the thief was taken into custody, the tension in the store slowly began to dissipate. People returned to their shopping, their conversations picking up again as if nothing had happened. But for those who had witnessed the scene, nothing would ever be the same. They had seen a lesson in humility, a reminder that underestimating someone could lead to consequences far greater than anyone could expect. Steven Seagal turned to leave, his calm demeanor never wavering. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle. Without turning around, he spoke quietly, almost to himself, "The quiet ones are always the most dangerous." And with that, he stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind a group of people who would never forget the lesson they had just witnessed. The store manager, now left alone with the other customers, looked around at the stunned faces. "Remember this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The world isn't always as it seems. And sometimes, the person who seems the least threatening is the one you should never underestimate." Have you ever underestimated someone and learned a lesson the hard way? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The sound of the police sirens outside the store grew louder, breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the convenience store. The thief, now completely defeated, stood with his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back, ready to face the consequences of his actions. His mind was a whirlwind of regret, fear, and disbelief. How had it all gone so wrong? 1 minute, he had been walking into the store with confidence, ready to make a quick score, and now, here he was, standing in front of Steven Seagal, a man he had underestimated in every possible way. The store manager, still standing in front of the thief, watched the events unfold with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. He had seen similar situations before, but something about this one felt different. This wasn't just about a failed robbery. It was about the kind of person the thief had tried to rob. Someone who had been through the toughest of situations and had the inner strength to handle whatever life threw his way. Steven Seagal, the embodiment of calm and strength, hadn't needed to do anything extraordinary to stop the thief. He had simply stood there, unwavering, giving the thief no room to maneuver, no room to escape the inevitable. The thief had tried to play the game, but he had no idea he was up against a man who had mastered it long ago. There was no fight, no shouting, no drama, just quiet, absolute control. As the police entered the store, the officers quickly assessed the situation. One of them walked over to the thief, his face stern but professional. "You're under arrest for attempted robbery," he said, handcuffing the thief with practiced ease. The thief didn't resist. He couldn't. He was broken, his bravado shattered, his sense of superiority completely obliterated by the quiet man he had foolishly tried to rob. The store manager stepped back, allowing the officers to do their job. He had seen this kind of thing before, but never like this. Never with such a clear display of the power of composure and inner strength. He turned to Steven, who had remained quiet throughout the entire process. "I just want to say, thank you," the manager said, his voice full of respect. "You didn't have to step in, but you did, and you handled it like no one else could." Steven nodded, his face still calm. "No need to thank me," he said quietly. "This wasn't about doing the right thing. It was about showing him what happens when you make assumptions. About me, about life. He needed to learn that." The officers, now taking the thief out of the store, paused for a moment as they passed Steven. One of them, an older officer with a weathered face, gave Steven a respectful nod. "You handled that well," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Not everyone would have stayed as calm as you did. You saved the day with nothing but your presence." Steven didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, acknowledging the officer's words without the need for further conversation. He wasn't interested in praise or recognition. For him, it was just another day. Another lesson in the quiet strength that had served him throughout his career, both on screen and off. But there was something different about this moment. Something profound in the way the thief had been humbled, not by force, but by composure, patience, and understanding. As the police officers left with the thief in tow, the store began to return to normal. The customers who had been silently watching the scene unfold went back to their business, some still talking about what had just happened. The atmosphere, which had been tense and charged just moments ago, was now calm again. But for those who had witnessed the event, things would never be the same. The store manager turned to Steven once more, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "this is something I'll never forget. You didn't just stop a robbery. You showed us all the power of calm in the face of chaos. I think that's the real lesson here." Steven smiled faintly, a hint of approval in his eyes. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is nothing at all. Let the other person reveal who they really are. And when you know who they are, it's easy to make the right decision. The manager nodded, still processing the weight of Steven's words. "I think you're right. It's just, not everyone knows how to handle a situation like that. Most people would have reacted with anger or fear. But you showed him, and everyone in this store, that there's more power in restraint than in aggression." Steven didn't respond immediately. He simply turned toward the door, his calm, steady presence filling the room. As he walked toward the exit, the manager couldn't help but watch him for a moment longer. The quiet man who had defused an entire robbery with nothing more than his composure. The man who had shown the thief, and everyone else in the store, what it truly meant to be powerful. When Steven reached the door, he paused, his hand resting on the handle. He turned back slightly, looking over his shoulder at the manager. "Remember this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The most dangerous people are often the ones who don't make a sound. They don't need to. Their actions speak louder than words ever could." And with that, Steven Seagal walked out of the store, leaving behind a group of people who would never forget the lesson they had just witnessed. They had seen, firsthand, what it meant to stay calm in the face of danger, to remain composed when everything around you is falling apart. And they had learned that true strength doesn't come from what you can do to others, but from what you can hold back, what you choose not to do. It was a lesson that would stay with them long after Steven had left the store. The manager watched Steven walk away, his mind racing with the realization of just how much had happened in those few short minutes. He turned back to the store, taking in the calm atmosphere, the customers going about their business as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. He had just witnessed a lesson in strength, in humility, and in the power of remaining calm when faced with chaos. The door of the convenience store swung open as Steven Seagal walked out, his quiet, commanding presence leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the events inside. The once chaotic atmosphere had settled, replaced by a strange stillness, a calm that lingered in the air. Customers who had been casual observers of the attempted robbery now stood in a collective silence, their minds processing the lesson they had just learned. As the door closed behind Steven, the store manager remained standing near the counter, his hands resting on the edge, staring at the space where Steven had just stood. His thoughts were racing, still trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The thief had come in with the intention of causing chaos, expecting an easy target. Instead, he had been confronted with something he could never have anticipated, a quiet, unassuming man who had disarmed him without lifting a finger. The manager had seen his fair share of difficult situations in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had witnessed firsthand how a person could defuse a tense situation with nothing more than their presence. The power of composure, the strength that came from remaining calm when everything around you was spiraling, had been on full display. The store, a place that was once just another stop for a quick purchase, had become a lesson in humility, strength, and restraint. As the last of the police officers left the store, escorting the thief to the squad car, the manager turned to the other customers who were still lingering, processing what they had just seen. Some of them exchanged glances, still unsure of what to make of the scene they had just witnessed. The man who had tried to rob the store was now in police custody, but the real question was, what had they all learned from this encounter? One of the customers, a middle-aged man who had been standing near the counter during the incident, stepped forward. He was still shaking his head, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. "I've seen robberies before," he said, his voice a little shaky. "But this was different. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. That guy didn't even need to raise a finger. He just stood there, and that was enough." The store manager nodded, understanding exactly what the customer meant. "It's about presence," the manager said quietly. "About how you carry yourself. People who know who they are, who are comfortable in their own skin, don't need to prove anything. They don't need to show force. It's the quiet ones, the ones who remain calm, who are the most dangerous." Another customer, a young woman who had been browsing the aisles during the incident, spoke up. "I never thought of it that way. I always thought the tough guys were the ones who fought back, the ones who shouted and got aggressive. But Steven Seagal didn't do any of that. He just stood there, and the whole situation changed. It was like he was in complete control the entire time." The manager smiled faintly, impressed by how quickly the customers had grasped the lesson. That's exactly it. He didn't need to fight or shout. His strength was in his calm, in his ability to stay in control of himself when the rest of the world is losing theirs. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom behind the words. "I guess I've always been quick to react, to fight back when things go wrong. But maybe the real power is in knowing when to stay still." The manager watched the young woman for a moment, noticing how the situation had affected her. She wasn't the only one. It was clear that the quiet power of Steven Seagal had left a lasting impression on everyone in the store. The thief's arrogance had been stripped away, not by force, but by Steven's ability to remain composed in the face of aggression. And in doing so, Steven had demonstrated a lesson that wasn't just about self-defense, it was about how to navigate the chaos of life itself. As the minutes passed, the store began to return to its usual rhythm. The customers who had witnessed the robbery and its aftermath slowly began to move on, but the conversation continued. Some of them lingered by the counter, discussing the events they had just witnessed. Others quietly reflected, no longer simply thinking about the convenience store as a place to grab a quick snack, but as a space where a lesson in life had unfolded. The store manager glanced at the security camera footage on the monitor behind the counter. He watched the silent interaction between Steven Seagal and the thief play out once more. It was almost surreal, how the situation had unfolded with such minimal movement, no shouting, no violence, just two people standing in stark contrast to one another. The thief, desperate and nervous, and Steven, unflinching, embodying the calm that had ultimately controlled the entire room. The manager leaned back against the counter, his mind still processing the encounter. He realized that this wasn't just about the thief or the robbery, it was about something much bigger. It was about how the world viewed strength and power, and how the most dangerous people were often the ones who didn't need to show it. The people who could remain calm, composed, and in control when everything around them was unraveling. Those were the people who commanded true respect. The next few minutes passed in relative silence as the customers finished their purchases and began to leave. But the manager knew that the lesson from today wasn't one that would be forgotten quickly. The presence of Steven Seagal had changed something inside the store, and in the minds of those who had witnessed his calm, controlled demeanor. Before the manager could leave for the day, he looked one last time at the door through which Steven had exited. There was no dramatic exit, no fanfare, just a man who had walked into the store, silently confronted a thief, and walked out with the quiet dignity of someone who had already won the battle. There was no need for applause, no need for acknowledgement. The lesson had been learned, and the impact would be felt long after Steven Seagal had left. As the manager locked the door at the end of the night, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had been part of something rare, something profound. He had witnessed firsthand the power of composure, the strength that came from not reacting, but from simply being. And he knew that, like the other customers, he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. Have you ever faced a situation where staying calm made all the difference? How did it change the outcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from.